we use Zoom at work, and every time you start recording a meeting, it prompts everyone to accept that consent, and it, in a way, like resets the entire meeting because everyone's videos goes off until you give consent, which doesn't seem like the best experience, but I get where they're coming from. So we'll dive into today's topic,
Yeah.
the topic of AI evals. It's following a whole new way of AI product building. There's many tweets, threads about how that is the new skill set that every product manager has to learn. Given the depth of this topic, we'll break it into 2 to 3 episodes. This can be our Evals 101, introduce the topic. Then we'll talk about LLM as a judge that can help you evaluate your own AI products and eventually talk about how it all fits together. So it's not just about building AI evals, but how do you build AI evals to improve your product, which is the end goal, and how do you operationalize it?
Yeah, it's a big topic, it's a heavy topic, and it's a very controversial topic. Like, there's a lot of drama in the space as well. And I think when we first talked about evals and we thought about learning what it is, we underestimated like how deep this rabbit hole goes. And so I don't think we'll be able to cover it in one, right? And you had the great idea to split it and make it a series. So today is just the basic 101 that we've learned about evals. And the most important question is, what are evals? So I think today we're going to start with just our initial impressions and understanding of what evals are. And then maybe we'll dive into why we need to do evals and what was some really good practical advice we got from a podcast episode on Lenny's by Hamel Hussain and Shreya Shankar. And that really gave us a good idea of what evals are. And in this episode, we're going to then dive into that, what we've learned. And then towards the end, maybe we'll come back to finally what a good definition of evals is.
Yeah, so I'll define what the purpose of evals is, which is essentially like it is a measurement tool. You're trying to measure how well your product is behaving in terms of its quality, in terms of its effectiveness, so that you are able to use that measurement as a way to either gauge is it performing as expected. If not, it's a feedback mechanism to improve the product itself. I know, like, I personally like the comparison of AI evals to software regression tests, even though they're not the same, but at least it helps me better understand what that concept is altogether. Because being in product management, building tech products, one aspect of building products I really enjoy is stress testing, working with the QA teams and like seeing is the product behaving as it's supposed to or not. And oftentimes you have to think about the edge cases, the rare scenarios, and that stress testing is something that excites me. So when I look at them side by side, it helps me deepen my understanding. And it's also important to know the difference between the two because when you build traditional softwares, they're deterministic. So it's easy to evaluate if it's behaving with a binary yes or no. And if a specific use case is not accounted for, you can then improve it. In case of AI products, because they're not deterministic, they're meant to be more dynamic. The effort required to build these evals is a lot more, and it's less about just building binary yes no flags or yes no unit tests. You truly have to think about defining the quality, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. So that's one thing that has helped me, and I'm curious to hear like how have you understood the concept of evals, Mohit?
My understanding has changed so significantly. When somebody talked about AI evals, or I read a post online without really knowing what evals are, it just seemed like tests. It just seemed like automated tests, which we've been doing for ages in software. And so I didn't really understand what the big deal was. I had so many misconceptions. And one of the biggest ones is that you can do evals without launching an AI product. There's all this talk about eval driven development, and it's absolutely nonsensical because Evals are created for a product that's currently already out there. And it has been out there long enough to have had like many, many interactions with actual users. I thought, you know what? If I'm going to create an AI product, I'm going to start with evals and I'm going to first think about everything, every kind of test that this AI product needs to pass. And so it'll have to pass all the evals, and then I'll know this is a good enough product to launch. But I think as Hamel and Shreya pointed out, you just never really know with AI products until it hits the real world. AI products are not deterministic. You do not know what the LLM is going to respond. So until it actually hits the messiness of the real world and actual user interactions, you can just never really know what you're meant to test for and what are the critical error modes that you'll have to prepare for, test for, and then fix.
Yeah, and something I realized recently because we've been using tools to build different prototypes using these AI tools, and I was working on just a sample app where the ask was to create an app which is meant to showcase events happening for product managers. And when I did that, it initially gave me a search bar, which was a good starting point, but that requires a user to think about what to search for. So my next prompt for it was look at sources from Eventbrite, from Luma, and a few other points. So I essentially gave it instructions to look at public websites and extract events from there and show it to me, which it did that. So now instead of just giving me a search bar, it created a web app where on the homepage itself, it's listing different events that are happening and you can sort it by city. The interesting thing was it was also pulling events that had happened in the past. So it would say an event is happening on November 5th and it'll have the topic, but if you click on it and you go to the actual website on meetup.com, that event had already passed, so you'll receive an error. So I think that's a true example if I was going to like move forward with that app and building it, where one use case that I'll have to check for is like, is it looking at events that are happening after the date the user is using the app. And that could very well be like an eval that I have to build. It's checking like, is it showing events from future dates as opposed to showing things in the background?
Yeah, what I really love about having finally understood evals is that you really do not have to do evals for everything, right? And that was a relief, honestly, for me. Because I was thinking, oh, there's just so many error modes that you'll have to test for, and I'll have to do evals for every single thing. But the good part is when you get into like analyzing errors and figuring out where the AI is going wrong, sometimes the fix is just so simple. Sometimes the fix is just something you missed in your prompt. Like the majority of errors can be fixed with just either fixing your prompt, maybe changing to a better model that is more suited to your use case, or just fixing some parameters in your product. And it's those really pesky ones that remain. Like you said, in your case, you might have put it in your prompt and you're using one of the best LLMs, but it's still doing something a little bit annoying, and it's difficult to pinpoint why it's doing that. And plus it ties to a core value of your AI product, like a core value proposition. And so those are the cases where you would invest the time to actually create an AI eval. And I remember in the meeting follow-up agent that we
Yeah.
demoed in the previous episode, there was one really annoying issue where sometimes it would detect everything correctly and it would just create the event at like 1 hour away from when the actual time was finalized. So somebody had in the meetings suggested a time and everybody had agreed to that time. But when it would actually go and create that meeting, it would be 1 hour away. Like if the meeting was for 1 p.m., it would create a meeting at 12 p.m. I think those are the kind of cases where you've kind of checked all your boxes, you've fixed your prompts, you've optimized everything, but it's still going wrong. And so that's where you would create an AI eval, right? And I'm curious to know if you felt the same kind of relief that I did, that you don't have to go ahead and create an eval for everything.
Still feel that there's a need to assess if you need an eval or not, so that human judgment
Mm.
is still relevant, and then you can determine if that like the human judgment and feedback is good enough, or you need to create like LLM as a judge, which is something we'll dive into the next episode. But I had a different question in my mind, right? So if I go back to my example, so I'm using Lovable to create a meetup app for product managers. Now it is showing me events from the past, and it should ideally only show events that are happening in the future. So one thing is, Lovable can make their app smart enough where when people are asking for events, then it's always looking at forward-looking events, forward-looking flights. But if I'm building a product with specific use case, I also have to keep in mind the the judgment that needs to happen, whether it's a human, whether it's LLMS judge or other ways. So maybe we can talk about like the different types of evals that could happen. But I had a different question. I still feel that there is a need to answer your question to see like what the output is or to check what the output is.
Yeah, for sure. And like the process of building evals first starts with the whole process of checking your logs, right? Checking what the agent has responded to actual user queries. And so I think a big part of it is the whole error analysis, data science aspect, where you're diving into data and you're trying to figure out what's going wrong. And then you're trying to categorize all the errors into like different failure modes. And then you would then need to figure out what type of evaluator you need to build for that. So in terms of the types of evaluators, I think that is highly dependent on what type of errors you find your agent making. And so you are keeping all of that in mind, and you're creating your unit tests. The next level, after you've done all the basic ones and all the ones that you can predict and you've covered your bases, is the kind of evals that we really want to focus on in this series. And these are the ones which take some effort to develop. And therefore, you need to make sure that you're investing your time wisely. And so there would be two broad categories that the experts talk about. One of them is the code based eval, and the other is the LLM as a judge eval. And I think of the two, the LLM as a judge eval is maybe what people are talking about 90% of the time when they're talking about evals today.
Yeah, and that's also quite intensive to build for the long run because the code-based evals, as I understand, is not sufficient. I've also read a third, which is human-based evals, and that could be
Mm-hmm.
like a domain expert, a product manager, manually providing feedback. Although the human-based eval will eventually feed into building LLM as a judge, so it is a stepping stone towards LLM as a judge. Uh, it's not a category in itself where you do human evals and you stop there. Maybe that's true for code-based evals as well. It's important to understand all of them because they also have different purpose. The ideal state is having LLM as a judge.
Yeah, and there's a really important point in this entire process. You need humans. It's just never fully automated. And that was such a calming thought for me. And it felt so nice to finally see a domain in which you're not talking about replacing humans with AI, and rather you need the humans to improve the AI. And there's just no way to get the humans out in the eval building process. Hamill used, maybe you remember the term, it was like a dictator, but a
Yes.
good dictator.
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, like a benefactor, but
Benefactor.
a dictatorial benefactor or something. But that needs to be a human. Like you need a domain expert, someone with end-to-end knowledge of the domain who can accurately judge whether an output is correct or wrong. And through the process, the expert also realizes, oh, they haven't thought through everything. And so that's a big benefit of doing evals is other than the end goal of getting to the evals, you're also learning a lot more about what you should have planned for and didn't. And so you're learning a lot about the product in general. But yeah, the domain expert needs to probably also have some good like customer experience kind of mindset. You need to know what good UX or what good responses sound like. And so I think that's where a product manager could be a good fit. A product manager with good domain experience is probably the ideal person to be the human in the process and to be able to judge whether an output is good.
Term was benevolent dictator. So a single
Yeah, that's the
expert,
one.
single authoritarian. Uh, Having a domain expert start with this human feedback and data labeling, creating that golden data set, and throwing all the buzzwords out there is a good starting point.
Still coding.
Yeah, I do see a need for having multiple people being in the process, although it's a balancing act because if you have too many people, then you may also get contradicting feedback where you have a paralysis and it takes much longer to determine what that actual feedback is and train the models. So, but I think it's a balancing act because if I think about it, like if I let's say I'm building a AI chatbot that can handle customer request. Yes, as a product manager, I have an idea of what I want that to look like, but my feedback may be limited to, say, someone who was in the customer support team. So if you have that partnership, that feedback can be a lot more valuable as opposed to having just a product manager or even just someone from the support team. Uh, and depending on the product itself, you have to consider who are the right people to be involved. Maybe it's not 10, maybe it's two or three. One might be too less, 10 might be too many, and it's probably finding a good middle ground.
We have read different takes on that from different experts in the field. I know one thought is you have one person who's dictating pretty much everything. And then there are other expert written pieces in which they say maybe it should be a few people. Maybe one person can check the outputs of the other person. And as a group, you'd get to a better outcome. But you probably don't want to be doing it as a committee. I think that's maybe an anti pattern here where you don't want too many cooks in the process. I don't know, maybe two or three experts who can kind of, brainstorm and get to a mutually agreed pass and fail decisions on the AI's output.
Yeah, it's about defining the roles, what type of feedback we are trying to gather, and define the structure. And so the dynamic nature, the multidimensional output of LLMs makes it a lot more difficult, but also a lot more critical to be built.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the team composition stays the same as for any software product. You have your product manager, you have engineers. In fact, I think maybe it's less useful to talk about the exact job titles there and more like responsibilities. There's the responsibility of engineering the thing and designing the thing. And then you need product management and you need domain expertise. And the composition of the team could be different, but at the end of the day, that's what you need for all software products. And I don't think AI products are any different in that respect.
Great. Yeah, I I read a good article from Booking in how they built LLM as a judge, and they talked about how the type of feedback with one person versus more than one person was just drastically different, and it was just an evolution. You start with one, then they had to move with multiple, and you do see a contrast because you are getting more data points as well as different perspectives. So when we think about the team composition, you would have a product person, you will have an engineering person as well.
And if we zoom in on the product manager's input, that's one perspective that you just cannot do without. Because, like Steve Jobs once said, to craft a really good product, you need to keep like 5,000 things in your mind at the same time. And the product manager knows about the customers and they obviously should know what's important for the business and they should, in collaboration with their technical team, figure out what's feasible and the tech behind it. They need to understand some of that as well. So each specialized role there would be looking at the output of the agent in a slightly different way. And engineering would look at it from engineering perspectives, like is it getting like the formats and stuff right? But you really need that product manager to have that holistic approach and just keep that customer focus in perspective. One really good example about the product manager's perspective there was in that Lenny's episode with Hamel and Shreya, where one output from that agent just simply answered the question in a straightforward manner. I think the user asked, do you have any two bedrooms in the area? And the AI responded, sorry, currently we have no two bedrooms in the area. Like from an engineering perspective, that's the right answer. But from a product perspective, it's really, really not, because you know that a question from the user should not be taken at face value. You need to know what the user is trying to get. You need to know the needs. Like if they're searching for a two-bedroom, like any good real estate agent as well knows that a person searching for a two-bedroom is not locked in on that criteria. It's not set in stone. You need to really figure out what their needs are and suggest something which might not match their criteria 100%. I know the last time I moved a few months ago, and the criteria that we had initially is nowhere near the actual condo that we ended up renting. So I think that product manager perspective of keeping everything in mind to judge the output is really important.
Yeah, yeah, it's tricky, right? Because you could argue that it did answer the question, so it was factually correct, but it missed the broader
Yeah,
context of the conversation. Yeah,
definitely.
this is where if you were to create a code-based evals, you might create something that says the the LLM behaved as it was expected to do because it did provide an answer to a question. So good binary yes, no. And that's the limitation of a code-based evals. A human in the loop, depending on who's looking at it, may have a different feedback. Uh, LLM as a judge, which is built based on the human and the feedback, be able to assess the quality of the answer, not just like if it answers. I think it's a question of like, is it functional versus it answers the question versus the quality of the output itself.
One big problem is like these terms which are doing a lot of heavy lifting. Like the word evals is doing so much heavy lifting in the whole conversation around evals today. In Hamilton Shreya's definition of evals, I think is very different. And I think part of it is because if you're including the whole process of error analysis and then thinking about what evaluators to build, that whole process is also evals. And I think that's Hamel and Shreya's definition. And at certain times when you talk about evals in a specific context, it's about that LLM as a judge evaluator. But you're using the word evals for both the entire process that includes the error analysis piece. And you're also using the word to talk about that specific evaluator that you have built.
Yeah, the buzzword is definitely there. It reminds me when prompt engineering was the hottest skill. It's just like if you can
Yeah.
write a good prompt, you can get a great output, and that's the skill you have to master, which is still relevant. And now there is sufficient information available to structure your prompt. And you have seen that even if you give it the same slightly different prompt, would result in different output. And sometimes if you ask the same prompt at different points of time, you receive the different output. And that evolution is why evals is very important because people suddenly realize that depending on who's asking the question, when the question is asked, you are receiving different outputs. So now you have to be able to evaluate all of the scenarios. You have to start from the basics. You open a spreadsheet, you create columns, you look at scenarios, you rate those scenarios with good, bad, or pass fail. You provide a critique, which is very labor intensive, but they know that statistically it is important to get that feedback. And they even talk about it's not doing this for 5 scenarios, you have to do it for 100+ scenarios. So, so I think you do know that they are experts in that field and they're taking the approach of how can I teach someone to think about evals? Arman talks about how do you split responsibilities between different teams. And collectively, once you have enough information, you can use that as a way to build LLM as a judge. Where I remember, like when I read Booking.com, which was written from the data scientist team, they just dive into LLM as a judge.
Yeah. In the hype cycle, we're at the peak right now. And we know evals are very important to the point where going forward, they're going to be the differentiator. Because as it gets more easy to build AI products, it's going to be easy to replicate products as well. And the time spent in building the right evals is going to be the differentiator between companies. And I think it already is, because there was probably a lot of gatekeeping of the whole evals process because it's been going on for a while. And all these great AI products are built with evals as the foundation of the quality of those AI products. And now that it's kind of become popular and the whole process has been opened up. We're talking about it a lot more, but I think the best AI companies had probably been doing this for a while. And so, yeah, we're at the peak hype cycle with evals. I don't think we've crossed over to the point where we've started seeing videos and posts about evals is dead yet, like you see for RAG. Like RAG dies every week these days, but eval's not quite there yet. But I think it's inevitable.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, for
coming.
sure. And perhaps like in the next episode, we can dive into the LLM as a judge topic, which we talked about quite a bit. And uh, I'll create a spreadsheet, do some examples on my own, because that way we can walk people through like what it takes to build that golden data set, how you can like be a domain expert in providing that feedback, where you're acting as a human in the loop, which is the only eval process you may have in place initially, where a human judgment is the best judgment you have. Over time, building a judgment model, of course, makes it more ideal and more scalable. We talked about human evals, code evals, LLM as a judge, the process for each one, how they matter. But the biggest learning has been it's more than a QA process. But I like your point. You have to talk about like how they all fit together as well.
And let me just read my definition that I wrote down,
Okay.
and and let's see if that covers everything that we've learned so far. So here's what I've written down. Evals are specific tests for an AI product that's meant to detect problematic responses that are important to fix because they directly affect how useful or valuable the product is, and are hard to fix with simple fixes such as changes to the prompt, the model, or the model's parameters. That's one definition, but also as an add-on, evals also refers to the entire process from identifying these problems that require automated evaluators to creating and deploying those evaluators. So that has been like the sum of my understanding of evals so far.
Great. That was spot on. It's like two similar but yet different definitions, but they also correlate to each other. All right, so we'll wrap up here, and this was a good starting point for us and just sharing what we have learned so far, and we'll come back next time around just talking about LLM as a judge.